Okay, 1994 free agency. Man, this was kind of a crazy period for the Dallas Cowboys. A lot of moving parts, a lot of changing strategy on the fly. All right, keep in mind, 1994 was the second year of open free agency in the NFL, and it was the first year with the salary cap. So teams across the league were learning and adapting as they went along here. So first, let's take a look at all 18 of the Cowboys' unrestricted free agents heading into the 1994 offseason. You had Kevin Gogan, John Giesick, Nate Newton, Frank Cornish, Dale Hellestrae, Mark Stepnoski, Daryl Johnston, Scott Galbraith, Tommy Agee, Bernie Kosar, Tony Casillas, Jimmy Jones, Ken Norton Jr., Matt Vanderbeek, Bill Bates, Joe Fishback, Elvis Patterson, and the kicker, Eddie Murray. Jimmy and Jerry, big gamble here. Jimmy and Jerry were hoping that the prospect of helping the Cowboys make a run at a third consecutive Super Bowl would lure players back to Dallas at a discount. But once Cowboy players started signing contracts in other cities, this plan slowly but surely just came unraveled. Jimmy Jones's 4-year, $7.7 million contract. This basically created shockwaves around the entire league. Now, Jimmy Johnson, for his part, he tried to downplay the loss of Jimmy Jones, suggesting that the Rams had basically way overpaid for his services, which they had. But if Jimmy Jones, who had been a backup defensive lineman in Dallas, if he could get that kind of money, what did that spell for some of the bigger name talent available from Dallas? Okay, and then after Jimmy Jones, then John Giesick signed a 3-year, $3.6 million contract with Washington. Jerry Jones tried to suggest that the free agent market, that it would flatten out somewhat, but it never really did, at least not where the Cowboys were concerned. After Giesick joined the Redskins, Jimmy Johnson went on record and said that it was a priority now, that the Cowboys lock up their 3 free agent starting offensive linemen, Mark Stepnoski, Nate Newton, and Kevin Gogan. But even that notion appeared to be a bit unrealistic in the face of just the offers, the size of the offers that just kept rolling in. The Philadelphia Eagles were courting Nate Newton at this time, and were rumored to be on the verge of offering Newton, who had been the starting right guard for the Cowboys, a 4-year contract in excess of $6 million. The Chiefs came along and offered defensive tackle Tony Casillas approximately double of what he had earned in Dallas in '93. It was after this news about Casillas that Jimmy Johnson, he shifted gears in his offseason philosophy. Instead of planning on relying heavily on free agency to round out the Cowboys roster for another Super Bowl push in '94, Johnson decided it would be more prudent just to put more emphasis on the upcoming draft. Casillas' what was then an imminent departure, because it was predicted that he was going to accept the offer from Kansas City. His imminent departure convinced Johnson that it was time for some new and younger blood along the defensive line. And along these same lines, Johnson started kicking the tires on an idea that had actually been at the back of his mind all along. There is a story that has been told a few times of a meeting between the Cowboys coaching staff in the spring of '94, and at this meeting, Jimmy Johnson opened up the floor for discussion on the possibility of releasing All-Pro defensive end Charles Haley. Now, the new guy on the block here, the new offensive coordinator, Ernie Zampese, he was said to have spoken up in defense of keeping Haley on the roster. Basically, the gist of what he said was, you don't cut a player the caliber of Charles Haley. Now, whenever I've heard this story, it's always been told in the vein of, boy, Jimmy Johnson was kind of daring and reckless. How could he possibly think of actually cutting Charles Haley, the team's best pass rusher? Was Jimmy crazy or something? I've heard Jerry Jones talk about this meeting. He was, of course, in retrospect, all in favor of keeping Haley. And he said something really interesting. He said, we couldn't spell Super Bowl without Charles Haley. But, that's where he and Jimmy disagreed. That may have been true when the team traded for Haley 2 years before. The 1992 Cowboys really could not spell Super Bowl without Charles Haley. But this was a different team now, a team sure of itself, extremely confident. Tony Tolbert was a better defensive end going into 94 than he had been in 92. Leon Lett was a far better player, as was Chad Hennings, Russell Maryland. The cornerbacks were better, the safeties younger and faster. There was a different vibe in the locker room, a different expectation. The leadership that Haley brought to the table wasn't as vital anymore to making up a Super Bowl package. So the Cowboys no longer had to have him on the field to be successful. So Jimmy devised a plan. He called up his good friend and former defensive coordinator in Dallas, Dave Wanstead, who was going into the second season of a rebuild there in Chicago. The Bears were on the verge of releasing veteran defensive end Richard Dent. After talking with Wanstead, Jimmy's plan became clear. He was going to cut Charles Haley and replace him with Richard Dent for 1994. The move would save the Cowboys some salary cap space, something they were very much in need of. And it was a safe move because it probably wouldn't come back to bite the Cowboys either. Look at it. Look at the situation. Haley, as a free agent, wasn't going to join the 49ers. He had already burned too many bridges over there. His personality would likely clash with Reggie White and others in Green Bay. Who else could A, afford him, and B, provide him the opportunity of playing for another Super Bowl? Because that's all that Haley cared about at that point of his career. If he was going to play, he was going to play on a team that had a realistic shot of going all the way and winning it. Maybe the Raiders. And if that happened, if Haley signed on with the Raiders, Jimmy wasn't going to lose any sleep over that. The Raiders were in the AFC. Jimmy was more concerned with his own turf, own territory in the NFC. Now, as we know, Jimmy was soon, he was ousted as the head coach, so his plan never came to fruition. But there is a ripple effect to consider and appreciate right here. The rest of free agency appeared to go off pretty smoothly for Dallas. Not perfectly smooth, but better than it had started out. The team made Darryl Johnston the highest paid fullback in the league. Nate Newton signed a 3-year deal with the Cowboys. Mark Stepnoski signed on too. Those were all key signings, important signings. But what, I ask, if Charles Haley had been gone, just like Johnson had planned? If that had been the case, the Cowboys would also likely have had the money to re-sign right guard Kevin Gogan. Remember the priority of Jimmy's priority to sign those 3 offensive linemen, Newton, Stepnoski, and Gogan? Well, Gogan got away. Gogan up and jumped ship to the Raiders, a move that Jerry Jones would later publicly regret for allowing to happen. And also, if Haley had been gone, the team would have had more money to try to lure Ken Norton Jr. into re-signing. But instead, Norton signed on with the Cowboys' greatest nemesis and threat to the title, the San Francisco 49ers. Jerry Jones would live to regret that move as well.